We have a great show today. We're going to talk about depression in teens and kids and how it's become more prevalent. We're going to talk about how parents can recognize it and what they can do about it. We want to help those kids any way we can. So stick around. I think you'll really enjoy this show. And of course, stick around to the end as we talk a little bit with our uncensored exclusive content, Fauci's Follies. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural edition of the Spectrum Report Uncensored. There's a lot of stuff that we like to talk about that we're just not allowed to talk about on regular social media platforms. Other people do it. I don't know how they get away with it, but you see it every day. People are censored. Their social media gets shut down. Their advertising accounts get closed. We can't afford to have that happen to us. So we started this new show, the Spectrum Report Uncensored, and it's exclusively on Rumble. So if you are watching us today, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you'll be notified when we're putting out new content, okay? So today's guest is Jennifer Kozek. She's a mother, wife, board-certified psychotherapist, and internationally recognized blogger, advocate, and national speaker. Jennifer has seen the anxiety and the autism epidemic unfold in her private practice and has watched the harmful impact of medication on many young clients. The ADHD epidemic turned personal when Jennifer's son was diagnosed. She plunged into the world of safe and natural healing modalities outside of the pharmaceutical model. She is the author of a 5-time award-winning book, Healing Without Hurting, Treating ADHD, Apraxia, and Autism Spectrum Disorders Naturally and Effectively Without Harmful Medication, and has also released a children's book, A Healthy New Me and ADHD Free. She's also been featured in the Heal documentary on many podcasts, news stories, and her articles appear in many publications. Jennifer consults and blogs with thousands of moms through social media to teach them about alternative and natural solutions. To receive more info on how you and your family can overcome ADHD, apraxia, anxiety, and more without medication, you can visit Jennifer's website. There's also a link there to the Heal documentary, and we'll put a link there in the description of the video. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Jennifer to the show. Jennifer, thank you for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure. I think this is your, third time? We had you on before to talk about each of your books. You're always a great guest, great information. And today's show is something that has, it's been weighing on my heart as I have a teenager, his friends, the talk and things that we see in the news. So I definitely appreciate you being here. Anything new in the works or anything you want to tell us about before we get started?
Not really. I mean, I've been continuing my blogging, my Healing Without Hurting page. I try to write articles, updates, things that are going on. But that's pretty much it. I always talk about wanting to do another book, but maybe when things, kind of calm down. My therapy practice has been really, really crazy. And I guess that's why you had me on today, because of the amount of teenagers actually that I'm starting to see in my psychotherapy practice. And sadder cases of kids that are literally, very, very depressed and very anxious. And it's exploding, and actually,
yeah.
It's very, very
and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to talk to you. The last year and a half has been hard on everybody, but we have a tendency to sometimes forget about how this stuff impacts our kids. They hear us worried, they're locked down, their school disruption changes. One of the things that I've pointed out recently is there are kids that, they went to school in 8th grade. They went on spring break. Now they didn't come back to school until they're in high school. And many of them started the school year, their first year of high school, virtually. You had seniors who missed out on all the great milestones that we all look forward to. The reason you work so hard to get that, high school diploma, your senior year, prom, homecoming, graduation, all that, they really missed out on a lot of stuff. So it's resulted in greater depression, anxiety, panic, all kinds of adverse effects have been noted to teens and even small children who typically didn't have to struggle with all of these things before. So there's definitely been an increase. And how has that affected? What have you seen as a result of this last year and a half?
Well, I see it first with my own kids because my kids, 13 and 15, my son just started high school. He lost the whole year and a half of his junior high middle school experience. He is my son who is on the spectrum, and he had even a harder time because basically we had to hire a tutor to help him with academically because he didn't have his paraprofessionals and other support team around him. And he also, he just, socially, he's a social kid, and for a year and a half. So I was watching this in my own life. My daughter, is typically very happy, go lucky child and involved in lots of activities, loves to go to, clubs and activities. And she couldn't do that for a whole year and a half. So we had to almost like artificially create social, environments for her. Luckily, I had a couple other families that were sort of in the same boat I was. There was so much hybrid going on and kids getting pulled out and pushed in. We just decided to keep our kids home. We didn't want them in masks for the entire time. I heard they were acting like robots in school, basically. They weren't even allowed to sit with their friends. They weren't allowed to high five each other in the hallway. I mean, these are the reasons we go to school. So, we started to see, even in my own family, we started to see what was going on. And then I started, getting more and more children, adolescents and younger kids coming into my practice for the same reasons. Because even if they were going to school, it was more like jail than it was school for a good year and a half. I mean, it's a little better now, but even outdoor sports with masks on in some states, I mean, my state's, completely all about the masks, but yet we can go to a restaurant, we can sit down and with, 100 people in the restaurant, that's okay. So apparently as soon as we sit down in a restaurant, we're all
I think
fine.
it's the height, right? It's
It's the height.
and
I don't,
and that's
you know,
you're right. I was not the best student, but I still looked forward to going to school when I was a kid. And
mhm.
after summer vacation or spring break, well, maybe not so much spring break, but summer vacation, I was ready to go back to school when it starts back up. There's such a big social aspect of it, and
Mhm.
I know a lot of these traditions are American traditions, but these kids have grown up looking forward to prom and these different things, and I can just imagine the poor seniors that worked for all that time and then weren't able to walk. We did some things here in our community locally. We drove around, kids that were graduating put out signs, and we drove
Mhm.
around, honked and waved and all that, but that's hardly the same.
Right.
So it has. Now, as far as your practice goes, like what I know you can't divulge any confidential information or anything like that, but what kind of things are you hearing from kids that maybe you notice is more prevalent or different than things that you heard prior to COVID, or maybe even in the beginning of COVID before the lockdowns kind of took their toll?
Well, I know a lot of before COVID, a lot of kids were very addicted to their video games and their online gaming and everything like that. But that just exploded over COVID. I mean, it really was their only social outlet, and it really created a bunch of, basically addicts when it comes to video games and all of these things. And even though it seems like our kids are connecting with other kids, it's clearly not the same. They're also joining chat rooms, which are very disturbing because some of them, it's almost like wet noodles trying to hold each other up. There are a lot of them that are depressed. They're finding other depressed teens and they're talking about their depression, but in an unsupervised and unproductive way. So they're it's almost like being in a support group, even in a hospital setting where, kids that weren't otherwise getting any type of ideas as far as cutting themselves or committing suicide. I mean, some kids are actually talking about how to do it, like how's the best way to kill yourself. I mean, this is what we're dealing with. So, kids are spending way too much time online. So that I think is a huge, 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 huge uptake They're also being pulled a lot of, like, even my daughter, she was dancing for 10 years. And when COVID happened, she did not want to dance with a mask on. And so she quit something that she loved for 10 years. Luckily for her, she's very well resourced. So she was able to find other things to keep her occupied, and other things like playing the piano. She started an Etsy business online. She started taking some courses online. But not all kids are that resourceful, nor are all kids that personality. So we're getting a lot of kids that are just isolating themselves in their bedrooms. As far as like looking for signs of depression and anxiety, just dropping out of life basically. And it was almost like an invitation to drop out of life. Like in the beginning, I think we all welcomed it, because part of the problem with the anxiety is that we're overscheduled. So I
Right.
think for the first month and a half, it was actually very, very relaxing when they said you have to go home and you can't go to school. And we all stayed home and cooked together. But that got very old very
Very
quickly.
fast. Right.
And then these kids don't want to go back because now they're out of condition. I have some kids that were athletes that were looking, colleges were going to be looking at them, and now they can't even play. So
Oh,
then what happens to those kids that were supposed to get scholarships?
right.
And now they're not conditioned. And if the parents don't have money to pay for coaches, which luckily a couple of my clients' parents did, but most parents can't afford that, or people were too scared to do coaching with children because of the whole thing. Those kids were not staying conditioned. So they basically were dropping out of sports that they were looking actually at colleges. So this is like totally devastating to a child that's worked their whole entire life, playing basketball or playing some other sport. And all of a sudden now they're not doing it. So now they're also not getting the physical exercise, and they're dropping out of sporting events and things like that. So that's a huge problem. Kids just don't even know where they belong. The segregation and the discrimination now that's going on between who's vaccinated, who's not vaccinated, who likes masks, who doesn't like masks. Well, if you like masks, then you must have voted, for Biden, and like,
Right.
it's unbelievable. And us as adults, we're feeling that. And the kids they're like little mini adults. So they're picking up whatever the families are doing is basically what they're coming to school with. So that's a problem, because kids that were playing with other kids, all of a sudden their parents are telling them not that they can't hang out with this kid or that kid because this kid's not vaccinated, or this kid doesn't wear a mask, or vice versa. It
Right.
goes both ways. It's not just one side or the other.
Well, and they tell them they're
You know,
dangerous to each other. So
they're
now the
dangerous to
people
each
that were their
other.
friends are dangerous. They don't care about
They
you,
don't care.
or
And then they have
they're
these
being
masks
told,
on.
right.
You can't see a smile. You can't see if someone's looking at you. There's no the developmental disabilities that we're creating in our children, especially the young ones that don't know any better. I mean, the older kids, at least, and I find too at the high school level, that, a lot of it depends on the teacher, but like some of them, like we'll give them more mask breaks, or like let them take it down if they're, far enough from the kids, they don't have symptoms. So the younger kids, though, are so compliant, and they want to listen to the teacher, and they want to, pay attention and listen to the rules. So they keep it on their face. And there is absolutely no socialization, no picking up on social cues. I mean, we have a generation of children. We already had a generation of children that didn't know how to socialize. And now what are we doing?
Yeah,
Like how,
the disconnect is even greater.
the
And you
disconnect.
mentioned, the kids online interacting with each other. So on the one hand, you think, well, at least they have access to one another through video chat and stuff like that. But I mean, you mentioned the dangers of the weirdos that they could be interacting with. That's one thing. But even interacting with their friends, now they've gone from sometimes being physically present to almost always doing it via computer, video, that type of thing. And a lot is still lost. You walk into the average teenager's bedroom now, and it's dark and gloomy in there, and they're huddled over their computer or their
They
phone.
have their sweatshirt over their heads like this.
Yeah, and they're still isolated, and you go, "Hey, what are you doing?" "Oh, I'm talking with my friend." But there's still such a limit to that type of relationship. You're not getting Your body needs the presence of another human being. It needs some touch. It needs a lot. I mean, we're built. Is I always joke with my wife. She's a pack animal, and I'm a lone hunter. But I have to admit that even this lone hunter likes to be in the company of the pack,
Right.
more often than not. So
Yes.
we're built for that. We're built for community and
Mhm.
relationships, and it's the virtual thing is just not doing it. You mentioned when you talked about the chat rooms before, you mentioned something that I've really been thinking about too, is the people they run into in chat rooms and videos. And I'm wondering, in addition to COVID and all of that, the last couple years, it seems there's been just an explosion of these like pseudoscience and kids and young adults who think that they are psychologists. They give this advice because they personally have anxiety or they have struggles or whatever. And they're gathering little tidbits of truth and little tidbits of fiction from all over the internet. They're putting them together. They're making very convincing videos.
Mhm.
And what's happening is amateurs are almost giving advice like experts.
Yes.
And what are kids going to do? They're always going to listen to other kids before they listen to us, right? So,
Mhm.
what do you think? How much do you think that pseudoscience and that it's almost like when, they always say a doctor makes the worst patient, or the doctor
Right.
who treats himself as a fool, that type of thing. How much do you think this pseudoscience and this diagnosis of one another in peer-to-peer treatment, how much do you think that is contributing to the increase in like anxiety and depression?
Well, I definitely think there's a lot of copycats. I think also that people want to belong. They want to be a part of something, and so I have clients, and I see all the time the teens that want to hold on to their diagnosis, whatever it is, because they feel like they're part of something, which is a very sad to me because that's like you said, human nature is we want to belong. We want to believe that we belong to something. But I do think there's a danger in, I mean, everyone that interacts with our child is potentially helping to raise them. So we have to be very, very careful as far as what they're learning, how they're learning it, who they're learning it from, how qualified the person is, and that's giving them this information. And I mean, listen, like we were all kids, right? Right. We understand that we learn about sex for the first time, and a lot of times it's with our friends. And some of the information they give us is correct, and some of the information is completely incorrect. So of course, there's always been that. But I think now the kids are seeking out this information, and these people, I think there's like a dopamine thing that happens in people's like they want to see how many likes they get, and they want to see, the social media thing has changed everything because, people just put stuff out there just for effect, and it's not even necessarily the truth. So this is where the parent involvement is so, so important because we just assume when we send our kids to school that the teachers are doing their best job to keep them safe and teach them all the right things. And now we're starting to recognize, well, no, could there be things that our kids are learning at school that might not be completely true, or maybe just very one-sided? We can just say that. Or
Right.
how about what kids can be on the line and be learning something from a YouTuber, and maybe some of the information is correct and some of the information is not correct. So we really should be paying closer attention to who our kids are interacting with, even when it's on the internet.
Right.
Um, and everything's on the internet now. And now, since school started on the internet because of COVID, the other problem is a lot of these teachers are now teaching remote, like basically teaching to a computer. So if a kid has a book that they're reading in class, it used to be that the teacher would send a book home and the parents would clean out their backpack with them. Oh, what are you reading? Blah, blah, blah. And now parents are very unaware of some of the things that they're learning in school from their peers, from their teachers, because everything's now online. Everything's a video that they're watching. Everything is a book that's literally virtual. And
Right.
unless we're in their Google Classroom or whatever we're doing, or we're in their chat rooms, we don't know what they're doing or what they're learning or what they're absorbing. And they're like tiny sponges. They're going to pick up everything they hear, everything they learn, and they're going to ingest it. So we better be prepared as parents to understand, to sort of unteach in some cases, um, everything down to a value system. I mean, or they're learning a value system out there, and some of it might be wonderful and some of it might not be wonderful.
Right.
um,
And if we
and
want it to be consistent with our
yeah,
values, then
right.
we need to be aware and we need to be involved for sure.
Right. Absolutely.
So what are some of the things that a parent, I mean, unfortunately, I think a lot of times depression is mistaken or anger or yeah, depression is mistaken for anger. Kids are
Hmm.
just angry. And
Right.
we, it's always kind of a joke. Your kid comes home, they're sullen, they're slamming a door, they're pouty, they don't want to talk to you, and somebody will just dismiss it. Like, oh, teenagers, right?
Right.
And there is some truth to that. There's hormones, they're figuring out who they
Hmm.
are, they're listening to us argue about all kinds of stuff. I could just imagine the toll it's taking on them because here we're telling them as they're being raised up and going through school, think of your future. This is for your future. Do this for your future. And now they hear on the news that because of the climate change, there's no future and COVID's going to kill us all. And this politician or that politician is going to cause the demise of the country, the world. So kids are starting to think, what are we doing this for? There isn't a future. And I can see where that would definitely lead into that hopelessness that would become depression and all of that. So as our kids are going through that, what are some of the things that we should look for that maybe we would say, hey, that's not just normal, teenage angst or some, what are some of the ways that we can identify that they might be struggling with anxiety or
Hmm.
depression if they're just not willing to talk with us about it right away?
I mean, you bring up a good point as far as fear, because I think fear is the driver of hate. It's the driver of anxiety. It's the driver of depression. So they're living in it's a PTSD world right now. Everything that we're learning about, everything that we're hearing about is doom and gloom. And so again, talking with our teenagers. And if they don't want to talk to us, to set rules around that. Like you can't just go to your room and watch TV. Like, I always recommend that, TV gets turned off at a certain time. TV's not in somebody's room. Computers, are in the main part of the house only. So there are things that we really need to do as parents. We really need to set boundaries. But important though, I mean, so some things to really look out for obviously is the amount of time they're spending on social media and or devices, first of all. Another thing to really look out for is, are they just not wanting to be a part of family activities anymore? That's a big one. I mean, a lot of kids will say, well, that's normal teenage stuff. Like who wants to hang out with the parents? But again, and at that point in their parenting, as parents, we go, you know, it's probably better if, we kind of leave them alone and give them some privacy. And I've seen pretty horrible things happen because parents give the kids privacy. Little did they know that the kids are setting up their suicide plan. And the parents don't realize it until after the child has passed away. So, I mean, that happens. So we really, really want to be paying attention. Um, but, a change in diet, weight gain or weight loss, we want, I mean, again, give them privacy, but, if we're suspicious that they're cutting themselves or hurting themselves or burning themselves, I mean, these are things that sometimes parents aren't even noticing or paying attention to. So, um, very, very important that they have activities that they enjoy going to. It's okay if they change activities because kids change their mind. We all do. We've been doing this for these many years, but now we want to try this sport or that, club. But if kids are just not engaging, and I would definitely encourage physical contact with other people. And that's why I think being on a sports team or being in a club after school, because you do need that. I mean, even the little nuances, like just telling a joke to each other.
Right.
My daughter said the most interesting thing because last year she was in, a virtual for school, and now she's in school. I said, "What's the biggest difference?" She says, "I missed so much when I was virtual. I missed the smile. I missed the joke. I couldn't hear what the person was saying. So you sort of miss half the conversation. And that's what makes going to school fun, right? So you
Right.
kind of need all of it. And so definitely to get the kids involved and don't let them stay in their room, you know, with paper on their windows preventing light from coming in. I mean, this is
Right.
what they do, right? Kids that always have to have the blinds closed. And a lot of kids will say, well, I have sensory issues, especially kids on the spectrum. Like that's huge, right? Oh, well, they don't like noise. So they have noise canceling earphones, and then they don't like light. So they have the shades pulled. Um, so that's a warning sign that we need to
Mm.
do something even biomedically. So I've learned a lot through my journey as far as what sensory processing disorder is, even, which is usually mineral deficiency and
Hmm.
possible Lyme disease and other co-infections and things. So don't just chalk it up to genetics. Don't just chalk it up to, well, they're just teenagers. This is the time to really, really be paying attention because kids are under a lot of pressure right now.
Right. And you mentioned like touch, right? That's sports and a club. And, I guess I never even really thought about that. Think about in a normal day before COVID, think about how many times you touch or you're touched.
Yes.
In a very nonchalant way. It might be a pat on the shoulder, a handshake, a high five, boys, teasing each other, a little push here or
bump
there.
each other, yeah.
Right. And that's, I don't, if you count it, I think we'd probably be surprised before, pre-COVID, how many times a day you touch other people. If you counted it, I bet you would be surprised. But we do it. It's part of that pack animal thing. It's part of that camaraderie. And when you miss out on that, it's definitely a bad thing. So that's something, I guess, as parents that we can consider too. Hugs, if they'll allow it, make them do it. No keys to the car until I get a hug goodbye or whatever.
Right.
And a couple of things that we do as a family is, whenever possible, which is most days, if you work at it, we eat dinner together at the table. I think that's some days he works, he goes to school, he works, I come home, he's already come home from school and went to work. When he gets in, he's eating some leftovers. We go sit with him when he's eating. My youngest still at home. And when he's not working, we eat together, and he hates it sometimes. And he'll come with his phone. He's watching an episode of something, and we're like, no, that's not. Take the earbuds out. We're turning everything off. We don't eat with the TV on. And I'm certainly not being like I'm better than everybody, but it's one of the ways that I have to carve out that time with him is to eat dinner together. And it's something that he really can't deny. You got to eat. So you got to eat here. So, so that is important. And it's
also a check-in. I think you make a good point because it's check-in. So some people really do that. What's the best thing that happened in your day? What's the worst thing that happened in your day? Just ask very poignant questions. And mealtime is definitely one of those times to get that done. Another, or right before bed too.
Right.
Lay on their bed with them.
Right.
Talk to them about something silly. Ask them about something that you knew, they took a test. Like, how was the test? So, and kids will never talk to parents about things that are important unless they can talk to parents about things that aren't important. So
I like
that's
that. So
listen. Important to remember because
you don't care about Minecraft, but listen.
Right. Yes. That's a real important key to get to connect with your children because they are talking to us. We just don't want to hear
it. I have to admit, I've heard more about Kurt Cobain in the last few months than I care to. I like him; good music, but I know more than I needed to know. But my son's into it; he's learning to play guitar, so I listen, and I'm thankful that he wants to talk to me. So we want to watch for changes in their habits. We want to watch if they're withdrawing from things. And you mentioned too, which I like, don't get too excited if they change activities. If they say, well, I don't like to dance anymore and maybe I want to take martial arts, that's one thing. But if your kid's been dancing for years and they loved it and now they don't want to do it, they're just huddling in their room, then that is a sign that there's something going on. So if they're stopping activities, if their diet changes, their sudden weight loss or gain, and they're just trying to withdraw from people in general, those are all things that we want to kind of be aware of and start talking to them. And then, and
if they're very reactive too. There's one thing to be angry and having, sometimes like, yelling at, because you asked them to fold their clothes. And it's another thing to just be overreacting for every little thing. Like that's when we know the kids are really sad deep down or they're really angry at self. So a lot of parents don't pick up on that cue, but when kids are angry, 99% of the time they're angry at themselves. If they get mad at their sister because the sister's doing something, it's probably because maybe they don't feel like they can. So that's why they're reacting. So we always want to figure out what the triggers are. Right. And understand what the real feeling is. And that's another thing is that we don't really talk to kids about their feelings. We just talk about them, what they're thinking about, which is helpful. But unless we can really get them to identify feelings, it's a skill they'll have for the rest of their lives, and very worthwhile, investment as far as trying to, even if you have to all start with a chart, because
Right.
anger is only a reaction to a feeling, and so is anxiety. They're not really feelings. There are
Mm.
physical body reactions to something that's going on.
Mm.
And it's important that we have those feelings or those sensations, because it alerts us that something's going on.
Right.
So if you
So
see your kid
emotional
super anxious, yeah, or very
emotional
angry,
intelligence, is that basically, yeah, like, why am
yeah,
I
like
feeling
there's
this
something
way?
else deeper going on with them. And usually if you try to approach them at that moment, it's a lost cause,
Mm.
and that's the thing too. We never come back to them. We forget. We get busy. Um, Instead of saying, "Hey, when you couldn't find your shoes this morning, you seem to be really angry." Like
Right.
that doesn't really seem to fit, you know. And then usually it's like, "Oh, well, I have this really bad, this math test, or I couldn't find my shoes because I can't ever find anything. I'm always losing everything." Because again, it's usually about self.
Right.
So,
And there's this youth pastor from years ago that I saw. He mentioned, and I'm sure you've heard this or an equivalent, and he's not the first person to say it, but for every one opportunity you have to say something negative to somebody, specifically your kids, you have about 20 opportunities to say something positive.
right.
And we also forget that when they're
Mhm.
sullen and they're, in their room and they're crabby with us, it's hard for us to remember to go, hey, I love you, and I really like how you
Mhm.
were sensitive to our neighbor, or you helped the lady across that was really cool. So that's something I think we have to be more intentional too.
Mhm.
Lift them up,
Yes.
encourage them, let them know that you see the good and not just the bad.
Right.
And then something I kind of thought of, I have two boys and two girls. The oldest and youngest are boys, and the two in the middle are girls. And I realized, I wish I would have realized this maybe 25 years ago, but I realized just a couple years ago that men tend to treat our boys like men before they're
Mm.
men. And what I mean by that is, men, we rag on each other a lot. We'll
Mhm.
say little things like, "Oh, look, I did it. Really? Why didn't you do two?" or whatever. And for us, it's playful, but until you're sure of who you are and you have a place of trust and you know that this person cares about you, it's hard to
Mhm.
take that stuff in stride. So
Right.
I think it's important too that we do remember that we want to encourage and lift them up and give them the good news much more often
Much
than
more
we give
often.
them any bad news.
And
So
they also, kids developmentally, they don't get the kidding.
the
They're
sarcasm and the
they're
kidding,
very
right?
literal, right?
Right.
And so if you say, "Hey, you're joking," it's a joke, like, "Hey, you have two left feet," blah, blah, like, we think it's funny. And
Yes.
we're making a joke about their clumsiness, for example. But for them, they're hearing that as, "I'm a piece of shit.
Right.
I'm not good enough. I'm stupid. I'm clumsy."
Right.
That's how they're hearing it, because they're
Well,
very literal.
here's a real world example of this. She's going to kill me if she sees this. A friend of mine, when her when she was like 3,
Mhm.
she heard her dad say, "Pretty girls." He probably said this to his wife as a joke. "Pretty girls don't pee or poop."
Oh, no.
So her deduction at 3 years old was, "I pee and poop,
So
so
I'm
I'm
ugly.
not pretty."
Oh.
And she is, but for a
Mhm.
very long time, and
Mhm.
I would imagine she still struggles with that because that's 3 is an impressionable time for
Yes.
the male who you love the
Right.
most and loves you the most says something like that.
Mhm.
So I think it's important that we always remember that they can hear. Little ears hear. We think they
That's
don't,
right.
but my adult children now tell me, yes, we heard all of it. So it's something we have to remember.
Right.
But now, on the other hand of that, this is something I wanted to ask you about too. The victim mentality that we're seeing these
Mhm.
days. You mentioned it's a virtue, right? So
Mhm.
having a something wrong or something you're struggling with or something like that, they a lot of times see it as a virtue or an identity. Now I'm part of an accepted group and that type of thing. And while we do want to be sensitive to our kids, we want to lift them up and we want to deal with their issues, whether they're small or great. we also want to help them become resilient. That's what we're
Right.
here for. We're here to teach them that
Yes.
you're going to bump your knee and it's going to bleed, but you can clean it up and it'll scab over, and you should not stop skateboarding because you bumped your knee, right?
Right.
Where this day and age, it just seems like the first time a kid bumps his knee, they wrap him in plastic wrap, throw everything away, and that's the end of it. This is never going to happen again. We're
Right.
so afraid they're going to be hurt or experience disappointment that
Yep.
we weaken them instead of help them become more resilient. So how does a
Right.
parent navigate that, that fine line between supporting them, loving them, and nurturing them,
Right.
or versus turning them into, victims and weaklings? How do we do that?
Well, it's a good point because resiliency is the number one thing for health, for all, mental health and physical health. We're all going to get sick, but what is our immune system doing? Are we able to fight it? So it's the same. So emotionally, to raise, emotionally resilient kids, first of all, they need to see that we're emotionally resilient. So, if we're drinking every day, and that's what they're seeing as a coping skill, unfortunately, addiction becomes possibly in their wheelhouse and part of what they're doing. And those with addictions tend to be a little bit more blamey, I would say, of other people. It's this person's making me feel this way, blah, blah, blah. And not always, but it's just maladaptive coping skills. It's never anything negative. It's just, if we're doing this, we want to find healthier ways of coping ourselves. So first of all, it comes from, what's the family system like? What are we doing? Are we showing resiliency? Are we labeling ourselves? So I always will correct people. Like, instead of saying, if someone says, well, you're a liar, I said, no, you had lied. Like,
Right.
completely different. It changes the entire thing. And we're not constantly putting ourselves down constantly and then becoming like the victim of circumstances. So part of the resiliency too, when you want to build resilient kids, is letting them fail. I mean, when they were learning how to walk, we didn't stand holding their hand. They would never have learned how. We let go. We let them take a couple of steps and fall. And then after that, we forgot.
Right.
We forgot, and then, I think, I make jokes all the time about myself because it is more difficult, because we are talking about spectrum, right? It is much more difficult to allow a child on the spectrum because you don't know what's learned dependency and what's really they can't do it.
Right.
Right. So even as a therapist, with all my knowledge and all my knowingness, I tend to, depending on the nurture versus nature, again, depending on the nature of the child, I have two, and both of them are the opposite. Elena took the spoon out of my hand when she was 6 months old and said, I'll do it myself. And, in her little language. And I understood what she was saying because she had corrugated syllables, unlike my son, who just said da, da, da. And I thought that was language, and it wasn't until realizing what language was. But she would pull it out of my hand. They had a lot of nonverbal cues on that. My son literally would have his mouth open still. If I wanted to feed him, he'd probably let me. So part of it is nature. So it's a very hard to fight that. I mean, but we have to. So sometimes these kids just naturally, from the time they're very, very young, they just have more of a dependency personality. They want someone else to feed them. They want somebody else to help them. They want, and sometimes we're so rushed that it just seems easier. It seems easier to just tie their shoe than the struggle, because, especially Evan with all of his motor problems, like, to watch him was like so painful. So it's just easier to do it. So part of it is on speed. And then part of it is just because we can't handle our own pain.
Right.
We can't handle watching our kids suffer this way, or suffer. That's the word we use. That's the word we attach. But maybe they're doing it at their own pace. Maybe they're learning the way they have to learn. Maybe they have to get frustrated in order to say, you know what, I'm going to do it a different way. Because our kids today don't know how to problem solve.
Well, and that's where you use the word suffer.
It, right? Not all our kids, but
yeah. But it is a bigger problem. Yeah. And that's why, and I say this all, the problem is, we not only do we not want, I mean, nobody wants their kids to suffer or experience disappointment, but it's part of life. Life is tough. It's not fair. You have to work. No matter who you are,
Yeah.
or where they're, it still is tough. Everybody
Yeah.
has problems. They're just different. We don't want our kids to suffer or
Right.
feel disappointed, but which is, I can understand that, but we never allow them to suffer or be
Right.
disappointed.
Right. And
And
a little
I
suffering
always
is actually
tell, well, I talk about fairness, right? We have a warped sense of the word fair. Okay,
oh yeah.
if you and I go hiking and
Mm-hmm.
I bring lunch and you don't bring lunch, what's
Mm-hmm.
fair is I eat lunch and you don't. That's what's fair,
That's
right?
what's fair.
Now, what's
Right.
merciful is I would give you half my lunch because obviously you need it more than I do. So
Right.
I would give you, right? But the suffering, though, that we would both experience if we both forgot our lunch and I couldn't bail you out or you couldn't bail me out,
Right.
was that the next time we go hiking, we would remember to bring our lunch.
Right.
And that's an important, so a little
Learning.
bit of
It's learning.
suffering,
Yeah.
right? If you're not going to die, it's not going to cause permanent damage. A little bit of suffering is a good thing if you
Right.
learn from it. And I
Right.
think it's more important that we talk about the suffering and how to avoid it in the future rather than just completely removing it from their lives unless we
Right.
want them living with us forever.
Right.
And the same sometimes goes for anxiety or even a little bit of sadness. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
by any means mean to diminish anxiety or panic. But if you're walking into a room full of people you don't know, you should feel anxious a little bit.
Right.
That's what keeps you from walking in and acting a fool, right?
Right. Right.
So there's a certain mechanism that's part of our created being that prevents us from acting foolish, and
Right.
anxiety, being uncomfortable or nervous in a different situation helps us to recognize danger signals and avoid
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
And if we're always removing that, and that's one
Mhm.
thing, we I see parents do things for kids all the time, talk to the cashier, order their food. Why is that? Well, he's anxious, he doesn't like to talk. No, 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 honey. What are you going to do? He'll be living in his home with a hoodie on, ordering everything on an app, and that's
Mhm.
no good. So
Yeah.
how do we navigate that where we just make them do this stuff sometimes that, like, I'm sure you find even in your practice sometimes that might be part of the problem why you're having to talk to this person.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I mean, my dad always said life is fair and then you die. Life's not fair and then you die.
Yeah.
He would just always throw all that stuff. And, if I said it's not fair, if I said I was bored, he'd say, no, no, you're just boring. It's a difference, right? So
Right.
he would never let us get away with that kind of talk. So again, I think it's like, but it's like it became rote, right? I mean, every time, like if I was like, I can't do something, he's like, oh yes, you can. Like,
Right.
and he'd walk away. And then maybe in like a half an hour, if we really were struggling, he would, but then he would say, well, what do you do next? So he
Right.
was always
Help you,
teaching
not
mode,
do it for you.
not do it. He would never do it to the point where, I went to college and I'm by myself, like, so this is where, like, I remember like filling out applications all by myself. And I remember thinking like everyone else's parents are filling out their college applications, not my dad. He was
Right.
like, you want to go to college? I guess you have to fill out your application. Like, so I mean, obviously it can go too far sometimes, but I think in some ways, like I am totally resilient. I know how to fill out an application, know how to change a tire on my car. Like, um, these are life skills. So I think you're absolutely correct. We're taking the opportunity away for them to learn life skills, to problem solve, to figure themselves out. And it's a cultural problem in the world right now. And I don't know if it's because we overcompensated because our parents before, in my young life, I think there was less involvement. And I
Mhm.
think because overall there was a less anxiety. And I think it's the heightened anxiety in everyone that's just we're on this hamster wheel. And I think that that's probably part of why we're just jumping in to fix it. But we're there was an article written about 15 years ago. It was called "Are We Raising a Nation of Wimps?" Great article. I think it was like Psychology Today, and it talked about like kids that were cutting and doing all of these self-harming things, and they it was all because we were overdoing it for them, we emotionally and physically, that we were creating a society of kids that couldn't do things themselves. So
Right.
yes, I see that. And then how that manifests is they're 25 years old or older, they're literally in their parents' basement, they're on video games all day, they have no interest in getting a job, They also have these inflated egos of like, well, if I can't make $100,000 a year, then I'm not working.
Oh,
They have no idea that like you have to make the $15 an hour first,
right.
that your boss has to like you and promote you. And that's how life works. Even if you graduate from college, so I have these college graduates too that are sitting on their because everything came too easy for them. And, I look at my two kids, and my son struggles the hardest with academics, much harder than my daughter. But I have to say his work ethic when it comes to school and his work ethic when it comes is better than hers, because he's had to work so hard. He knows what it means to have to study. He knows what it means to have to like sit down and do the work, where she can get an A without even trying, which so it's almost like the same thing. If you're sitting in the living room without even trying, your mother's always just folding your clothes for you, you'll never learn how to fold the clothes.
Right.
So
This is the clip I'm going to show my 16-year-old.
You're right. Yeah, fold your own clothes. No.
Right. So
they'll
there
like
is,
you later.
and again, I think both of us would, you especially, would acknowledge that anxiety is real, depression is real. We're definitely not diminishing any mental health issue, but every bit of anxiety is not a mental health issue. Every sadness you experience or disappointment is not depression. And at some point, even if it's real anxiety, real depression, you want to treat it, deal with it, work through it so that you are more resilient, and then you can deal with some of these other problems. I think the act of accomplishing something and working through something ultimately will help you in the future as well. So
Absolutely. And you want to get to the root of it.
Right.
So if a person has anxiety or depression, you want to get to the root of why. If it's a trauma related situation, you want to get them the help. I do EMDR for trauma in my therapy practice. Psychotherapists are, we're here to help kids learn coping skills, to help kids work through feelings. So that's why we do what we do. And then on the other time, I am learning more and more about biomedicine and how our biology, and how if we're deficient in certain nutrients, how that affects our mood and our body, how we're functioning, our muscle function, everything. And so we don't do enough in this society to look for underlying causes. Kids just don't wake up anxious one day. Something has had to happen, either biomedically or emotionally, trauma, something happened. And we're just so quick to just give a kid a medication, ADHD medication if they're not paying attention, anxiety medication if they feel even the slightest bit anxious. And there's no investigation. We call off the search for any understanding of why these kids are this way in the first place.
Right.
And that's why I had to write my book, Healing Without Hurting, because there's 101 things we could be doing for our children that we're not doing. Whether it be therapy related, because I list all the therapy options, Western, Eastern. I name, all the nutritional deficiencies, what causes those, toxicity, what causes that. And we really have to figure out, why isn't a child sleeping? Sleep, that's another one. Kids are anxious because they're not sleeping. Kids are anxious because they're not getting enough protein, because they need protein to break down to amino acids, to break down into neurotransmitters and to create neurotransmitters.
Right.
So if you have no dopamine, you're going to be pretty depressed. If you don't have vitamin D, like vitamin D is the sunshine vitamin, you're going to be pretty depressed. A lot of these kids too, gaming, sweatshirts over their head in the basement, their vitamin D level could be at like 0.
Right.
That's not going to be good. So not only are they affecting themselves emotionally, giving themselves PTSD and all of that, but they're also depriving themselves of sunshine, and nature and exercise and all the things that help to build those neurotransmitters in their bodies.
It's good for your immune system. It's good for your mental health. It's good for your physical. All across the board. And there seems to be a couple different camps, so to speak, when it comes to things like therapy and helping kids be resilient and things like that. I don't think either of us are looking to change anybody's personality, right? If you're on the spectrum, there are unique gifts that come with that, right? Mm-hmm. There are good things that come with ADD or ADHD. It's learning to channel it so that it can help the kid become a productive adult so that they can enjoy life. It's not about managing them or making them easier for the parents to deal with.
Right.
It's about helping them be resilient and successful themselves
Right.
so they can get as much enjoyment out of life as they can.
Right.
Sometimes that's very limited. Sometimes it can be a very high functioning situation. Sometimes it's a temporary situation if they're not on the spectrum and there are other things involved. So, we've even got some blowback online from folks who are upset about our product, Neural Balance, because it helps to balance the endocannabinoid system. So it helps to deal with some of that sensory overload, anxiety, and things like that. But it doesn't make you drowsy or sleepy. We don't want to make a kid a zombie. We want to help them deal with some of the difficulties that come with having an out of balance endocannabinoid system. So we don't want to change personality. We want to help them. And that's what you're looking to do too, with the training and the counseling and the tips that you share with parents. It's to support and care for. You can't just ignore the difficulties that the kid is having and say, well, that's who they are because of this or that. That's not really healthy for them either. So it is important to find that happy medium. So we want to always support them with love, with some touch, with some good good nutrition, good food, and all of that great stuff. And almost everything that we've talked about, if not all of it, and then much more is found in your book. So, like I said, we'll link to your website so people can see where they can get that. And let me
we're really just maximizing their potential.
Right.
And whatever that potential is. And for some kids, they lose diagnoses altogether. I mean, in my mind, diagnoses are made up by pharmaceutical companies anyway. I mean, we could almost take anybody and everyone will have everything on the spectrum. In my mind, everyone's on the spectrum, right? We get that.
Right.
Somebody has a little anxiety, someone else has a little attention problems, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, there are some kids that are much more severe. But at the same time, we're just maximizing their potential. We want them to be the best that they could be. And yes, it helps the whole family system too, because when everyone's calm, that helps the situation.
Everybody's a little happier.
Everyone's calmer.
And I'd say the biggest fear that I mean, I can talk to a parent with a kid who's 3 years old on the spectrum. That parent's biggest fear is usually my kid's going to outlive me. And who's going to care for my kid? Nobody's going to love my kid or care for my kid, be willing to put as much effort into my kid as I will. So it's important that you do as much as you can to help them be as resilient as possible for their own sake. Because, chances are they're going to outlive you. So you do want them to be as happy and productive as possible, so that they're not just stuck in a home or something, or God forbid someone takes advantage of them because they're unable to care for themselves. So that's a big concern. I think helping them be more resilient and get through this stuff is definitely a big part of that. So, all right. Well, I appreciate you talking with me about this stuff. I think it's good content. Hopefully it will be valuable to our viewers. So now we are going to a new segment that hopefully we won't keep finding more things to make fun of, but the Fauci follies. You mentioned a few things during the course of the talk, and masks and mandates. I don't really want to discourage anybody from doing what they think they need to do to keep themselves or their family safe or anything like that. But I'm a big data-driven guy, and when I look at all of the different data that's out there, I don't think that the masks and the mandates are playing out to be such a great idea. But I'm not a professional either. But one thing that I do notice is daily, almost, we receive conflicting information from the powers that be. The CDC may put out 2 or 3 different statements that some don't make sense than the WHO. But who do you trust? You have a guy like Anthony Fauci who, all the way back to the HIV debacle during the 80s and all that, he was withholding information and doing things that were not at all helpful, but very profitable for him and the people he was associated with. in some cases very detrimental to people that were suffering with HIV. And now here we fast forward. I don't know how he's flown under the radar all this time, but he sits in a congressional hearing and he lies through his teeth, and people believe him because he is who he is. But then we find out a couple weeks later that it was true. What Rand Paul was questioning him about was true. The gain of function experiments and all that. So we find out that that's true. We find out that they've been funding it. That he's kind of kept a lot of information from us. It's one thing after another with this guy. So I mean, what do you think about that? How do we? Actually, since I talked to you just a week ago, what else have you learned about him? There was one since we talked, which I'm not. I mean, I don't mean to sound like jubilant about it because this is even more tragic. But here he's experimenting on foster kids, orphans in New York. So he's not a good guy. And this is a guy who's making the policy, it seems, for everybody, and we're supposed to trust that. So what do we even do? And what else have you learned that he's been up to that we can poke fun at him about?
Well, I always call him flip-flop Fauci because
I like that.
There's nothing he doesn't make any sense. I mean, he contradicts himself constantly. He says one thing, then he says the complete opposite thing. It almost feels to me that it's on purpose. Like it's on purpose to confuse us so much that we don't know what ends up. We don't know what to listen to. And science is an interesting thing. I mean, I don't think real science we've seen in 50 years or more. We would have to pull away from these corporations that have a tremendous amount of influence as far as what data is shared, what's not shared. The NIH, I mean, they talk about experimenting on, creating flies that are going to, potentially destroy us and kill us. Between Fauci and Gates, the two of them, their headlines are just insane. Like they're like psychics. Like they're telling us already that we'll be careful because we're going to, this is going to happen and that's going to happen. I think one of the latest headlines, I'm trying to think what it was, but it was just insane. Like we have to prepare ourselves right now for the next pandemic.
Right. Well, 2017, I think, right? Yeah. Bill Gates said we'll probably see, and Fauci, I think the same year, we will see, not even probably. They're sure of it, they're sure of it, which everyone should be like, well, why? Right. What's going on that's going to create that? And the Department of Health and Human Services, they're in on it too. I remember, because I've been in the medical freedom movement forever, and I remember sharing probably 6 or 7 years ago, there is actually a document. It's about adult immunization, and one of their big things was, how are we going to increase demand for adult vaccinations? Well, I might be a conspiracy theorist, but it seems to me that they've had these kind of plans for a while. That we realized that the patents for these vaccines came out way before the virus was a thing. So, we just have to start wondering what the heck. I mean, in Fauci, he's done experiments with, I think I sent that to you. Okay, was taking human skulls. And I mean, this goes beyond, this goes beyond beagles, right? We heard the whole story about the beagles, getting eaten by the parasites alive. And then, you look at, they take, monkeys, and they take humans, they grow monkey hair or rat hair on human babies. It was the other way around. They took embryos from scalps from aborted babies.
Right.
And were growing them on the back of rats.
Right.
And at first, I went straight to what are they trying to do? See if they can actually transplant a whole scalp. I went right to hair loss or something. Not that that's a problem for me, but it's a big business, right? So that was, but then as I read the rest of the article, they were doing it just so they could test the infection rate on the scalp. They wanted to see if this certain compound would cause this infection on humans, but they couldn't do it directly on humans. And it's like a mad scientist, like some Nazi doctor the things that they're experimenting on, they don't even seem like cures or something good. They're like, how can we infect people? How can we make
Right.
diseases more fatal, more infectious?
Right.
I'm like, what is this? What are you guys doing? Like,
Hmm.
in the for them to be doing these things in a lab in the U.S. or in China, and putting people at risk the way they are, and then covering it up, denying it when it does get out, it's
Right.
just it's
Right.
reprehensible. I mean,
It
and
is.
now here we are, almost 2 years later, a year and 8 months later, and people don't realize, I think, the lockdowns and the financial issues that it caused for us in the US, that affects millions of people around the world. We're the most charitable country on the planet. We
Hmm.
feed people, 10,000 miles away from us. There are
Right.
whole countries and communities that we feed almost on a daily basis. And because we've been unable to do the things that we needed to do commerce wise, those people are just left out in the dark. So
Yeah.
it's really taken its toll, and it comes down to, this originated from some crazy Nazi like experiments, and then it was made worse by the powers that be not speaking about it or offering the right treatments or advice when it first came out. So I don't know. It makes it hard to trust, though. You
Oh, absolutely. And if anyone's really truly paying attention, they're wondering what the heck we have. This guy is the head of our infectious control. Like it just,
right,
I mean, it's like a laughing stock. It's like, are we kidding? And there's no truth. So if they even showed us a little bit of truth, like it's like, well, the vaccines, could potentially cause some problem, but they're saying, nope, no problems, no
right.
side
Safe and
effects.
effective. Safe and
Well, is
effective.
it?
Safe and
It's like
effective.
boom, boom, boom. It's like anyone that could believe that narrative of being so black and white, it's astounding to me, honestly.
Right.
It's
And you're
absolutely
right. If they were more honest about some of the mistakes they've made or the adverse
astounding.
side effects of some of what they're putting out there,
Mhm.
I would be more apt to listen to some of their advice. But
Right.
when you're never willing to own any misstep,
Zero.
how do I
Zero.
trust anything? Yeah. So
No, zero. And when, Dr. Bricks, whatever her name was, came out and said that we're categorizing every single case, no matter if you had COVID or not, as a COVID death in April of 2020. How does anyone trust the numbers even?
right,
Like, how do we trust that 700,000 people have passed away? I mean, granted, a lot, we did lose people, but how much? We don't know, and so they, this, and then what happened to the flu? Like all of a sudden we have no flu cases, and the,
right.
car accident deaths have gone down like significantly. It just doesn't add up.
The numbers
None of it
don't.
does.
Yeah.
None of it.
Yep. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. I hope again that this was valuable for somebody. We definitely are always trying to do everything we can to offer content to help families. And this teenage depression and depression in children it's becoming a pandemic, an epidemic. I mean, it's a bigger and bigger problem, it seems like, by the year. And this last year and a half, it's grown exponentially, and we
And
just
not
don't want to
talked
miss
about,
it. Yeah,
which is another thing. Like our kids are not affected by this virus, but they are affected by this virus in this way. But we
right,
don't talk about this.
right. I mean,
This.
more kids have died by suicide than
Mhm.
from COVID.
Right.
But we are still just trying to force them to take these other measures to protect them against COVID, and in some cases those measures are just making things worse for them.
Right.
So I just again want to thank you. Links to your website and your book will be in the description of the video, so people can check that out. I appreciate you sharing some of that information with us. As I mentioned, your other book too, I really like, and that's the ADHD free. What?
Oh,
I mean,
ADHD. Oh, healthy
a
new me and
healthy new me.
ADHD
See, I
free.
missed you. Yeah. A healthy
Yeah.
new me and ADHD free. What I really liked about that book was it was for the siblings and for the kid who's diagnosed. We immediately go into medical jargon and stuff like that, but it helps them understand what this is about, and it helps the siblings understand how things are maybe going to change a little bit
Right.
in the family and why. So I always thought that was a really neat idea and definitely filled a need there. So we'll link to that as well. Any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say before we close?
No, thanks for having me. Really
And thank
appreciate
you.
it. Yeah,
Thank you for coming back again.
no problem.
I appreciate you. All right, I'm going to take care of a little business and we'll close the show out. As I mentioned before, this is our new show, the Spectrum Report Uncensored, where we have exclusive content that we can't talk about on, all the other social medias stations. My name is Gabriel Williams. I'm your host. I am the CEO of Spectrum Research Group. Spectrum Research Group is the maker of Neural Balance with Anandinol. And if you want to learn more about Neural Balance and Anandinol, you can go to our website and click on the How It Works tab. You can also check us out on Facebook. We have a support group on Facebook. And on YouTube, our regular censored show, where we have a lot of great content and a lot of videos already posted. You can check us out there as well. But for more uncensored content, you want to go to the Spectrum Report Uncensored on Rumble and subscribe so that you don't miss out on future shows. And when we make fun of Fauci, you definitely don't want to miss that. So join us next time as we try to come up with more content that will be helpful for you and your family and talk about things that will get us in trouble elsewhere. Thanks for watching.